Hello and welcome. Really glad you could join us. If you're looking to get a solid grasp on important topics without getting totally overwhelmed, you're in the right place. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something really crucial: the connection between trauma and depression. How does one actually lead to the other?
Yeah, it's a significant link.
Yeah.
We've pulled together insights from, well, several different angles to really explore this with you. We looked at articles about coping with trauma-related depression, a study from PubMed Central on emotional avoidance and social support, which is quite interesting.
Okay.
Also, some discussions on Reddit about childhood adversity's long-term effects, info from Psych Central on trauma, PTSD, and depression, and finally, some useful distinctions from the National Mass Violence Center about different kinds of support.
That's quite a range. So our aim here is to basically piece all this together for you. We want to give you a clearer picture of how trauma can, result in depression, what factors influence that, and also, importantly, where support and recovery can be found. We'll keep it straightforward, just the core knowledge you need. All right, let's get into it. When we say trauma, what are we actually talking about? It feels like a broad term.
It really is. Trauma can stem from a wider range of events than people might think.
Hmm.
Obviously, things like natural disasters, violence, combat, but also significant loss, a severe illness, even witnessing something traumatic happen to someone else, secondary exposure. And the immediate reactions, they can be intense,
Sure.
shock, terror, sometimes real rage. And these aren't just feelings. They cause actual physiological shifts, changes in brain chemistry, the chemicals flowing through your body.
Wow, so it's not just in your head, it's physical too.
Absolutely. It fundamentally changes how a person connects, both with themselves and with the world, with society. It can shake up core beliefs, impact basic psychological needs. You often see initial reactions like anxiety, grief, and, yes, depression, but also things like emotional numbness, maybe lower self-esteem, losing self-respect, shame, a lot of fear.
That's a heavy list.
It is. But it's so important for you to understand these are normal responses. They're normal feelings in response to completely abnormal events.
That's a crucial point. It's not a sign of weakness.
Not at all. Think of trauma as this sudden, unexpected loss. It could be loss of safety, loss of trust, loss of connection. And it can permanently alter how you see yourself and the world. And, even if several people witness the same event, each person's inner experience is unique. It can feel incredibly isolating.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
And that isolation, that experience, it can damage things like self-esteem, feelings of control, personal power, trust in others, trust in the world, being safe, really fundamental stuff.
Okay, that paints a clear picture of the initial shock wave. So how does this then connect specifically to depression? We hear about stress causing depression. Is it a similar mechanism?
There are definitely parallels. Depression that comes after major stress or distress often happens when events just feel overwhelming. And part of that overwhelm can be biological, like depleting certain brain chemicals. Serotonin is a key one here. People often call it the feel-good neurotransmitter. It's really involved in feeling confident, hopeful, having a sense of well-being, self-esteem.
Right, serotonin, we hear about that a lot with mood.
Exactly. So here's an analogy that might help. Imagine your brain has a kind of baseline level of serotonin, like water in a sink.
Okay.
A traumatic event can be like pulling the plug out of that sink. It causes serotonin levels to drop, sometimes faster than your system can replenish them.
Ah, so it drains the resources needed for feeling okay.
Precisely. And when those serotonin levels dip, it can trigger signals of, well, uncertainty, doubt, fear, anxiety. These feelings contribute to insecurity, low self-confidence, and that overall low mood, that hopelessness that we see in depression.
That analogy really helps visualize it. So the trauma happens, serotonin might drop.
Yeah.
What does that experience feel like for someone going through trauma-related depression?
It often plays out in, let's say, two phases that are kind of interconnected. There's the intrusive phase first,
Intrusive, meaning?
meaning the person keeps re-experiencing the traumatic event in some way. This isn't voluntary. It happens because the trauma creates such a strong learning imprint on the brain. The brain basically goes on high alert, trying desperately not to let that awful thing happen again.
Like it's stuck on repeat, trying to process it or prevent it.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. So anything that even slightly resembles the original trauma, a sound, a smell, a place, a feeling, can act as a trigger. And that trigger brings back recurring thoughts, intense feelings, physical sensations, memories. It's exhausting and deeply distressing. It often leads to feeling depressed, like you're trapped in the past, constantly under threat.
I can see how that would be completely debilitating.
It really can be. And then often the avoidant phase develops. It's almost like the brain trying to get a break from the constant intrusion. So the person might feel emotionally numb. They might, unfortunately, turn to substances to try and cope with those overwhelming feelings. And they'll likely start actively avoiding anything that reminds them of the trauma.
Like if someone is in a bad car accident, they might avoid driving, avoid certain roads.
Exactly. Or even avoid talking about it, thinking about it. The problem is, while avoidance gives some short-term relief, it really constricts your life over time. The brain worked hard to suppress those associations, those memories, but in doing that, it also dampens positive feelings, limits joy, and makes your world feel smaller and less fulfilling.
It sounds like a really tough cycle. You're trying to escape the pain, but you end up losing connection to the good things too.
That's often what happens, unfortunately.
Now, one of the sources, that PubMed Central study, looked specifically at this idea of emotional avoidance, but also social support. What did they find there?
Right, that was an interesting one. They looked at people treated in emergency departments right after a trauma. They measured emotional avoidance, basically, trying not to feel difficult emotions, and perceived social support, feeling like you have people who care and can help. What they found was pretty significant. Higher levels of emotional avoidance soon after the trauma were linked to worse depression symptoms a whole year later.
Okay, so bottling it up or trying to seems to predict later depression. Makes sense.
It does. But here's the really crucial part: the role of social support. That link between avoidance and later depression, it was much, much stronger for people who felt they had low social support.
Ah, so there's an interaction there.
Exactly. In fact, emotional avoidance was only a significant predictor of depression for people in roughly the lowest 40% of social support scores.
So if you feel like you have good support, that tendency to avoid difficult feelings might not hit your mood as hard down the line.
That's what this study points towards, yes. It seems low social support might kind of amplify the negative impact of avoidance. Maybe because if you don't feel you can talk things through or get comfort, you rely more on just shutting down those feelings.
Or maybe avoiding feelings pushes people away, so you end up with less support.
That's another possibility they mentioned, yeah. The avoidance could lead to isolation. They also found a similar pattern, though it was more exploratory, for PTSD symptoms as well. That same interaction between avoidance and social support.
It really underscores how vital those connections are, doesn't it? Especially when things get tough. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Childhood adversity came up in the Reddit discussions you looked at. That feels like another huge factor.
Absolutely huge. The conversation there really highlighted how those early difficult experiences can have such deep, lasting effects. Things like impacting cognitive control, emotional regulation, even how brain networks develop. And that could be a key reason why childhood adversity is so strongly linked to depression later in life. They also talked about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences.
ACEs, right. That term comes up a lot in health discussions.
It does. And the data, like from same HSA, shows how common they unfortunately are. About 28% of adults report physical abuse in childhood, 21% sexual abuse. But ACEs also include things like parental separation, living with parental mental illness or substance abuse, neglect, witnessing domestic violence.
A wide range of difficult situations.
Yes. And crucially, they often cluster together. It's rarely just one thing. And the research is very clear on the dose-response relationship. The more ACEs someone experiences, the higher their risk for all sorts of problems. Later health problems, social issues, behavioral problems.
The Reddit discussion had some powerful personal stories, didn't it? People talking about divorce, bullying,
Right.
abuse.
Really powerful. And there were insights about how the timing matters. Experiencing adversity when you're very young, before you have developed emotional coping skills, can hit differently than maybe experiencing something similar when you're older, though of course it's difficult at any age. There was also discussion around sort of our collective responsibility to support kids going through these things.
It definitely highlights how foundational those early years are. Okay, so we have trauma. We have potential childhood adversity. Let's clarify the relationship between trauma, PTSD, and depression. Psych Central had some useful points on this.
Yes, they did. They confirmed depression is a very common reaction to trauma. One review they mentioned suggested over half of people with PTSD also have major depressive disorder.
Wow, that's a huge overlap.
It is. And another study linked childhood trauma specifically to later depression, finding that a high percentage of people with chronic depression reported childhood trauma.
So what are the key depression symptoms we might see in this context?
Well, the classic symptoms: a real lack of energy or interest in things, big changes in appetite or weight, Sleep problems too much or too little feelings of guilt or worthlessness, trouble concentrating, and sometimes, tragically, thoughts of death or suicide.
And how does the trauma itself physiologically contribute to these?
Trauma really impacts the nervous system, the fight or flight response. Well, if fight or flight isn't possible or doesn't resolve the threat, the body can go into a freeze response. It's like a shutdown, a conservation mode. Polyvagal theory talks about this as the dorsal vagal state. And that state, feeling numb, disconnected, fatigued, slowed down looks and feels a lot like depression. Reminders of the trauma can trigger this state even long after the danger's gone.
That makes so much sense, explaining that kind of heavy shutdown feeling. So there's overlap. But how are PTSD and depression different?
Good question. They do share symptoms like poor concentration, sleep issues, loss of pleasure, irritability. But PTSD has its own unique cluster. The re-experiencing aspect, flashbacks, nightmares. The active avoidance of reminders. Specific negative changes in thoughts and mood related to the trauma. And that hypervigilance, being constantly on edge, easily startled.
Okay.
Depression doesn't necessarily have those trauma-specific re-experiencing or hypervigilance symptoms, though the low mood and loss of interest can be profound. But it's crucial to remember, as we said, they very often occur together.
Given this complexity, what helps? What about support, coping, treatment?
First off, self-compassion is huge. You survived something incredibly difficult. Acknowledging that resilience is important. Practically, getting a medical checkup is a good idea. Rule out physical issues. Then, consulting a therapist who specializes in psychological trauma is really key. Sometimes medication, like antidepressants, can help rebalance that serotonin we talked about, but that's always a conversation to have with a doctor or psychiatrist.
Right.
And maybe most importantly, remembering the trauma is an experience you went through. It doesn't define who you are. The depression related to it should lessen over time, though everyone's timeline is different.
Are there things people can do day to day to help themselves?
Definitely. Good nutrition supports brain chemistry. Maybe limiting excess sugar and caffeine can help stabilize things. Exercise is powerful. Even just 20-30 minutes of aerobic activity can naturally boost serotonin.
Okay, movement helps.
Yes. And finding soothing activities. Walks in nature, music, laughter, connecting with supportive people, staying hydrated, gentle yoga, maybe journaling thoughts and feelings. Just being aware of your symptoms. Understanding that depression is a normal response here and allowing yourself to share what you're going through without shame. That's all part of healing.
And in terms of professional help?
Psychotherapy is really the frontline treatment for both PTSD and depression. And specifically, trauma-focused therapies are often very effective when trauma is the root.
Like what kind of therapies?
Things like prolonged exposure, or PE, and cognitive processing therapy, CPT. These are evidence-based. Trauma therapy focuses directly on processing the traumatic memories, the difficult thoughts and feelings tied to them, and reducing that avoidance pattern. Therapy for depression might focus more broadly on current life stressors, negative thinking patterns, relationship issues, getting back into enjoyable activities, and building support. But often, treating the PTSD effectively really helps lift the depression too.
That makes sense. Now, the National Mass Violence Center piece, it drew a line between these trauma-focused treatments and something called trauma-informed resiliency. Can you unpack that difference?
Yes, that's a really useful distinction they make. They point out that after something like mass violence, people react differently. Some recover fairly quickly on their own, others develop PTSD, prolonged grief, depression. Trauma-focused treatments are those specific evidence-based therapies we just mentioned, like PE, CPT, EMDR. They directly target the core trauma symptoms, intrusions, avoidance, negative thoughts, hyperarousal. They're usually relatively brief, maybe 6 to 20 sessions.
So very targeted intervention.
Exactly. The goal is to directly process the trauma and reduce its ongoing impact. They involve things like learning emotion regulation skills, relaxation, changing unhelpful thinking patterns, gradually confronting feared memories or situations safely. That's exposure. The aim is less distress about memories, less numbness, less avoidance, less anxiety and depression, better daily functioning. They list several common ones: PE, CPT, EMDR, behavioral activation for depression, complicated bereavement therapy, trauma-focused CBT for kids.
Okay, so those are the direct treatments. What about the trauma-informed resiliency programs then?
These are broader approaches. They aim to boost overall well-being and coping skills, but they don't specifically treat the underlying PTSD or prolonged grief in the same direct, targeted way. They might borrow elements from the evidence-based treatments, and they can definitely help with some symptoms like depression, anxiety, sleep. They are really valuable. Think of things like peer support groups, groups that teach about trauma responses, psychoeducation, mindfulness practices, yoga, general relaxation techniques, stress inoculation training, interpersonal therapy, even things like acupuncture or exercise groups.
So more about building general coping and support.
Precisely. They're great for fostering resilience, maybe for people who don't have a full diagnosis or as a supplement to formal therapy, but they shouldn't replace evidence-based treatment if someone has significant PTSD or related conditions. They complement it.
That's a really clear distinction. Trauma-focused is the specific treatment. Trauma-informed is about building resilience and support more broadly.
You got it.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the most critical thing you want listeners to take away today?
I think the crucial understanding is just how significantly trauma and depression are linked. And that factors within our control, like how we cope with emotions and factors in our environment like social support really matter in the aftermath. But also, importantly, that there are effective ways forward through both those targeted trauma treatments and these broader resiliency building approaches. There's help and there's hope.
That's a really vital message. And a final thought to leave us with. Something to chew on.
Maybe just consider the wider implications of this. If we understand how deeply trauma affects mental health, what does that mean for us as a society? How can we create environments in schools, workplaces, communities that are more supportive? And how do we ensure everyone who needs it can actually access good, evidence-based help when they face adversity?
That's definitely something important to reflect on. Thank you so much for walking us through all of this today. It's complex, but you've made it much clearer. Really appreciate your insights.
My pleasure. Thanks for the great conversation.
And a big thank you to all of you listening for joining our deep dive. We hope you found it insightful. Until next time, take good care.